My name is Aurelia, and I thought I knew my family until my sister Mackenzie sent me a text that shattered 28 years of sisterhood. Do not come to my wedding. You are not welcome anymore. No explanation, no phone call, just those cold words that felt like a dagger through my heart. What she did not know was that I had been quietly managing the family trust fund she had been stealing from for 2 years, funding her entire wedding with money that belonged to all of us. Before we dive into how I exposed her lies and got the sweetest revenge, I need to know where my story family is watching from tonight. Drop your location in the comments below and smash that like button if you have ever dealt with family betrayal. Subscribe, because this tale of financial fraud and wedding day justice will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about blood being thicker than water. Trust me, you will want to see how this unfolds. The discovery happened 3 months before Mackenzie's wedding, completely by accident. I had been helping our elderly grandmother manage her finances when I noticed some irregularities in the family trust fund statements. As the designated financial overseer since our parents passed away 5 years ago, I had access to all the accounts, but I rarely needed to check them closely since everyone in the family was supposed to be responsible adults. That Tuesday morning in September, I was sitting in my home office reviewing bank statements when I saw monthly transfers of $5,000 from our family trust directly into Mackenzie's personal checking account. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through months of unauthorized withdrawals. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Starting 18 months ago, right after she got engaged to David, she had been systematically draining our family money. Our trust fund was not enormous, but it was meant to be our safety net, containing about $200,000 that our parents had carefully saved over decades of hard work. They had established it specifically to help all 4 siblings with major life events, buying homes, starting businesses, emergency medical expenses, and yes, weddings. The key word was all siblings. Any withdrawal over $1,000 required written consent from at least 2 family members. Mackenzie had never asked for permission. She had simply taken what she wanted, forging documents that I now realized bore suspiciously shaky versions of my signature. The wedding venue deposits the catering down payments, the dress, the flowers, the honeymoon reservations to Bali. Everything was being paid for with stolen family money, while she and David acted like they were funding this extravagant celebration themselves. I called our other siblings immediately. Marcus, our older brother, was furious but not surprised. I always wondered how she could afford that $20,000 wedding dress on her retail salary, he said. Our youngest sister, Isabella, was devastated. She had been planning to ask for help with her graduate school tuition from the trust money that was supposed to be available for exactly that purpose. The more I investigated, the worse it became. Mackenzie had not just been taking money for the wedding. She had been using our family funds to subsidize her entire lifestyle for over a year. The luxury apartment she shared with David, the new car, the designer handbags she constantly showed off on social media, all purchased with money that belonged to all of us. What made the betrayal even more painful was how she had been treating the rest of us during this time. She had become increasingly distant and hostile, especially toward me. She would make snide comments about my simple lifestyle, my secondhand clothes, my decision to rent instead of buy. She acted like she was more successful, more put together, more deserving of nice things. The irony was devastating. She was literally stealing from us to fund the superiority she lorded over us. The forged signatures were amateur at best. When I compared them to my real signature on file at the bank, the differences were obvious. She had practiced my handwriting, but not well enough. The bank had a responsibility to verify these large withdrawals, but apparently no one had bothered to look closely or call for confirmation. I spent 3 days documenting everything: bank statements, forged authorization forms, receipts that showed family money being used for personal expenses, even screenshots of her social media posts showing off purchases that we now knew were funded by theft. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The hardest part was realizing that this had been planned. This was not some desperate moment where she made a bad decision. She had been methodically stealing from her own family for months, watching us worry about money while she lived lavishly on funds that belonged to all of us. She had looked me in the eye at family dinners, listened to Isabella stress about college costs, heard Marcus talk about struggling to save for a house down payment, all while knowing she was the reason those funds were disappearing. When I finally confronted her over the phone, her reaction told me everything I needed to know. There was no shame, no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, she became defensive and angry, claiming she deserved the money more than the rest of us because she was actually doing something important with her life by getting married. She accused me of being jealous of her happiness and success.
"You have always resented me for being more ambitious," she screamed through the phone. "This money was just sitting there doing nothing. At least I am using it for something meaningful instead of hoarding it like some paranoid miser."
That conversation ended with her hanging up on me, but not before delivering the final blow. "Do not even think about ruining my wedding with your petty jealousy. If you try to cause drama, you will regret it." 3 days later, I received that text message disinviting me from her wedding. No explanation, no discussion, just a cold dismissal that felt like being erased from the family. She was trying to control the narrative to paint me as the problem while she continued her theft undisturbed. But what Mackenzie did not realize was that I still had complete administrative control over the family accounts, and I was about to use that power in ways she never saw coming. The morning after receiving Mackenzie's dismissive text, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and made a decision that would change our family dynamics forever. I was not going to have an emotional confrontation or cause a scene. Instead, I was going to expose her systematically and professionally, using the very same methodical approach she had used to steal from us. My first step was consulting with a forensic accountant recommended by my friend who worked in banking. Sarah Martinez was a no-nonsense professional who specialized in family financial fraud cases. When I showed her the evidence I had compiled, her expression grew increasingly serious. "This is textbook embezzlement," Sarah explained during our meeting. "The forged signatures, the systematic withdrawals, the attempts to hide the paper trail. Your sister has committed multiple felonies. The fact that it involves a family trust actually makes the legal consequences more severe, not less." Sarah helped me create an official audit report that documented every unauthorized transaction, every forged signature, and every violation of the trust agreement. The report was thorough, professional, and devastating. It showed that Mackenzie had stolen over $90,000 from the family trust money that she had no legal right to access. But I wanted more than just documentation. I wanted to ensure that she could not continue this theft, and I wanted her to face consequences that matched the magnitude of her betrayal. Sarah helped me develop a strategic plan that would unfold in phases. Phase 1 was immediate damage control. I changed all the security codes and passwords for the family trust accounts, effectively freezing Mackenzie's access to any additional funds. I also placed fraud alerts with all the financial institutions, ensuring that any future attempts to access the money would trigger immediate notifications to me and require in-person verification with multiple forms of identification. Phase 2 was evidence preservation. Working with Sarah, I created multiple copies of all financial records, correspondence, and documentation. We prepared a comprehensive report that could withstand legal scrutiny, complete with expert analysis of the forged signatures and timeline of the thefts. Phase 3 was the most satisfying strategic exposure to the people who needed to know the truth. I started with David Mackenzie's fiancée. The poor man had no idea that his lavish wedding was being funded by stolen money. I arranged to meet him for coffee, ostensibly to discuss wedding gift ideas. When I showed him the financial evidence, his face went completely white. "She told me her grandmother had left her an inheritance," David said quietly, staring at the bank statements. She said that was how she could afford all the wedding expenses. I offered to help with costs, but she insisted she had it covered. David was a decent man who worked as a teacher and lived modestly. He had been uncomfortable with the expensive wedding from the beginning, but Mackenzie had convinced him that she could afford it through this fictional inheritance. Learning that everything was based on theft from her own family left him shaken and angry. "What does this mean for the wedding?" he asked. "All the vendors have been paid with this stolen money. The venue, the caterer, the photographer. Everything is tainted." I showed him the audit report that detailed exactly which vendors had been paid with stolen funds. It was almost everything. The only legitimate expenses were the small deposits that David had insisted on contributing himself. David's reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. He was not just angry about being lied to. He was horrified at the idea of starting his marriage with stolen money. "I cannot begin our life together built on theft from your family," he said. "This has to be made right." Next, I contacted the wedding vendors directly. This was where my professional background in contract law became invaluable. I explained the situation to each vendor, providing them with copies of the audit report and documentation showing that the payments they had received were made with stolen funds. The legal implications were clear. Payments made with stolen money could be considered fraudulent transactions, potentially making the contracts void. Most vendors were cooperative once they understood the situation. They did not want to be unknowingly involved in a fraud scheme, and they certainly did not want legal complications. The wedding venue was the most important conversation. The manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, was initially skeptical until I showed her the comprehensive evidence. "In 30 years of event planning, I have never seen anything like this," she said. "We have a responsibility to ensure our business transactions are legitimate." Mrs. Rodriguez agreed to cooperate with my plan. The venue would continue to hold the wedding date, but any changes to the arrangements would require payment with verified legitimate funds. Since Mackenzie no longer had access to the stolen money, and David was reconsidering the entire wedding, this effectively put the elaborate celebration in jeopardy. The photographer and caterer had similar reactions. They were professionals who did not want their reputations associated with fraud. When presented with documented evidence of theft, they agreed to modify their contracts to require new payments from legitimate sources. But the most strategic move was my conversation with our grandmother, the family matriarch, whose trust and respect meant everything to all of us. At 86 years old, Grandma Rose had lived through enough family drama to recognize manipulation and betrayal when she saw it. I visited her on a Sunday afternoon, bringing the complete audit report and documentation. Grandma Rose had always been sharp with numbers. She had been a bookkeeper for 40 years before retirement. As she reviewed the evidence, her expression hardened in a way I had rarely seen. "That girl has brought shame on our family name," Grandma Rose said quietly. "Your parents worked their whole lives to build that trust fund, and she has stolen from her own blood for vanity and show." Grandma Rose's reaction was swift and decisive. She immediately called a family meeting for the following evening, demanding that all siblings attend. She did not tell anyone except me what the meeting was about, simply stating that there was important family business to discuss. The family meeting was scheduled for Wednesday night at Grandma Rose's house. I arrived early to help set up, bringing multiple copies of all the evidence. Marcus and Isabella came together, both curious about the mysterious urgent meeting. Mackenzie arrived last, looking irritated and checking her phone constantly. "I do not have time for family drama right now," Mackenzie announced as she walked in. "The wedding is in 2 weeks, and I have a million things to handle." Grandma Rose looked at her steadily. "Sit down, Mackenzie. We need to discuss your handling of the family trust fund." The color drained from Mackenzie's face, but she tried to maintain her defiant attitude. "I do not know what you are talking about." That was when I placed the audit report on the coffee table and began presenting the evidence systematically. Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, Forged signatures that clearly did not match my real handwriting. Receipts showing family money being used for personal expenses. Screenshots of social media posts showing off purchases funded by theft. The silence in the room was deafening as the magnitude of the betrayal became clear to everyone. Marcus was furious Isabella was crying, and Grandma Rose looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Mackenzie's response was exactly what I had expected: denial, deflection, and attack. She accused me of being jealous, claimed the money was rightfully hers, and insisted that she had permission to use the funds. When asked to produce any documentation of this supposed permission, she could not. The meeting ended with Grandma Rose making a formal declaration. "Mackenzie, you are no longer welcome in this family until you make full restitution for what you have stolen and apologize to each person you have wronged. Your wedding is built on theft and lies, and none of us will be attending to celebrate fraud." As Mackenzie stormed out, screaming about ungrateful family members who did not appreciate her success, I felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. The truth was finally exposed, and the consequences were beginning. But this was only the beginning of the justice that was coming for my thieving sister. The day after our explosive family meeting, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Mackenzie and a series of increasingly frantic text messages. The tone had shifted dramatically from her previous arrogance to desperate panic as the reality of her situation began to sink in. "You have ruined everything," read one message. "David is talking about calling off the wedding. The vendors are asking questions. Fix this now, or I will make you regret it for the rest of your life." But instead of feeling guilty or backing down, her threats only strengthened my resolve. This was exactly the reaction of someone who had been caught and was now facing consequences for the first time. I screenshot every message for my growing evidence file. My phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was David. "Aurelia, I need to talk to someone who understands what is really happening here," he said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "Mackenzie came home last night screaming about family conspiracies and jealousy. She is acting like she is the victim in all of this. I do not know what to believe anymore." I invited David to meet me for breakfast at a quiet diner across town. What happened during that conversation would prove to be the turning point in everything that followed. David arrived looking like he had not slept. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. As we sat across from each other in the worn vinyl booth, he pulled out a small notebook and placed it on the table. "I spent all night going through our finances," he began. "After seeing your evidence yesterday, I needed to understand what else might be lies. What I found is worse than I imagined." David opened the notebook to reveal pages of detailed financial calculations in his precise teacher's handwriting. He had been meticulously tracking every aspect of their relationship that involved money, and the patterns were disturbing. "The inheritance story was just the beginning," David explained. "She told me her family was helping with the wedding costs, which I now realize was technically true, just not in the way I understood. But there are other things that do not add up." He showed me entries documenting expensive purchases Mackenzie had made throughout their relationship: designer clothes, jewelry, spa treatments, weekend trips to luxury resorts. All of these expenses had been explained away with various stories about bonuses at work, gifts from relatives or sales, and discounts that seemed too good to be true. "I teach high school math, so I know numbers," David said with bitter irony. "Her retail job pays maybe $35,000 a year, but she has been spending like someone who makes six figures. I always wondered how she managed it, but she would get defensive whenever I asked questions." The most damaging revelation was that Mackenzie had been lying to David about more than just money. She had told him that I was jealous of their relationship and had been trying to sabotage their engagement from the beginning. She had painted our entire family as dysfunctional and unsupportive, claiming that she was the only successful one among us. "She made me believe that your family resented her happiness," David admitted. "She said you were all bitter about her wedding and were looking for ways to cause problems. That is why I was not surprised when she said you were disinvited. I thought it was just family drama. But now David was seeing the truth. Mackenzie was the one causing the drama, and she had been manipulating everyone around her to cover up her theft and maintain her facade of success. I cannot marry someone who has been lying to me about everything, David said quietly. This is not about the money, although that is bad enough. This is about who she really is as a person. The woman I fell in love with does not exist. That conversation led to the formation of what became our unofficial alliance for justice. David was not just hurt, he was determined to make things right. As a teacher, he had strong moral convictions about honesty and accountability. Learning that his future wife was a thief and manipulator went against everything he believed in. Our first joint action was contacting the wedding vendors to explain the full situation. David's involvement as the groom gave our efforts additional credibility. When he confirmed that the payments were indeed made with stolen money and that he wanted to ensure all transactions were legitimate, the vendors took the situation much more seriously. The florist was the most cooperative. Mrs. Patterson had been in business for 30 years and had never encountered anything like this. I have arranged flowers for thousands of weddings, she told us during our meeting. I have seen bridezillas, family feuds, and financial problems, but I have never had a bride pay for her wedding with stolen money from her own family. Mrs. Patterson agreed to cancel the elaborate floral arrangements unless new payment was made with verified legitimate funds by the end of the week. Since Mackenzie no longer had access to the stolen money, and David was refusing to pay for arrangements he had not authorized, this meant the wedding would have no flowers unless Mackenzie could come up with $18,000 from her own legitimate resources. The photographer, Jeremy, had a similar reaction. He was a young professional trying to build his reputation, and he did not want his business associated with fraud. This puts me in a really difficult position, he explained. I have already blocked out the entire weekend for this wedding, and I turned down other clients. But I cannot provide services that I know were paid for with stolen money. Jeremy offered a solution that was both fair and strategic. He would honor the contract only if new payment was made with legitimate funds, and he would provide documentation to law enforcement if needed. This meant Mackenzie would lose her professional photographer unless she could pay $15,000 out of her own pocket. The caterer presented the biggest challenge. The deposit alone had been $12,000, and they had already purchased ingredients for the elaborate menu Mackenzie had selected. However, when David and I met with the catering manager and showed the complete audit report, they agreed to cooperate with our efforts to ensure legitimate payment. But our alliance was growing beyond just the vendor negotiations. Marcus and Isabella were both actively supporting the effort to hold Mackenzie accountable. Marcus, with his background in business management, helped us understand the legal implications of the fraud and connected us with additional professional resources. Isabella, despite being the youngest sibling, proved to be surprisingly strategic in her thinking. She suggested that we document everything Mackenzie had posted on social media about her expensive lifestyle and wedding plans. She has been bragging about all of this publicly, Isabella pointed out. If this goes to court, those posts will show that she knew exactly what she was doing. We spent an entire evening going through 2 years of Mackenzie's social media accounts, screenshot every post that showed expensive purchases or bragged about wedding costs. The evidence was overwhelming: hundreds of photos showing designer clothes, expensive jewelry, luxury vacations, and wedding planning expenses that would have been impossible to afford on her actual salary. The most damning posts were the ones where she had specifically mentioned how blessed she was to be able to afford such a beautiful wedding and how hard work pays off. The irony was nauseating. She was literally bragging about stealing from her own family while pretending to be self-sufficient and successful. During this process, we discovered something that made the betrayal even worse. Mackenzie had been actively disparaging our family on social media while stealing from us. There were subtle but clear posts about toxic family members who were jealous of her success and unsupportive of her happiness. She had been crafting a public narrative that painted herself as the victim of family jealousy while simultaneously robbing us blind. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Our growing alliance attracted an unexpected member, Sarah Martinez, the forensic accountant who had helped me audit the trust fund. Sarah had become personally invested in the case after seeing the extent of the fraud and the sophistication of Mackenzie's manipulation tactics. "This is not just family drama," Sarah explained during one of our strategy meetings. "This is a complex fraud scheme that involved forgery, identity theft, and systematic embezzlement. Your sister has committed serious crimes, and she needs to face appropriate consequences." Sarah offered to help us prepare a comprehensive case file that could be presented to law enforcement if we decided to pursue criminal charges. She also connected us with a lawyer who specialized in family financial disputes and could advise us on our legal options. The lawyer, Patricia Williams, was direct about our situation. "You have enough evidence to pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery. The criminal charges would be for embezzlement, forgery, and fraud. The civil case would focus on recovering the stolen money plus damages." But Patricia also warned us about the potential complications of pursuing legal action against a family member. "Family courts see these cases frequently," she explained. "The emotional toll can be significant, and there is always the possibility that relationships will be permanently damaged." I looked around the room at our assembled alliance, David, who was reconsidering his entire engagement, Marcus and Isabella, who were both furious about the theft, Sarah, who was professionally outraged by the fraud, and Patricia, who was ready to help us pursue justice through legal channels. "The relationship is already permanently damaged," I replied. "Mackenzie made that choice when she decided to steal from her own family and lie about it for 2 years. Now she needs to face the consequences." The meeting ended with a clear plan. We would give Mackenzie one final opportunity to make full restitution and apologize before pursuing legal action. If she refused or continued her manipulative behavior, we would file both criminal and civil complaints. David volunteered to deliver this ultimatum since, as her fiancé, he had the most credibility with her. "She needs to hear this from me," he said. "Maybe if she understands that I know the truth and will not support her anymore, she will finally accept responsibility." As we prepared for what could be our final attempt at a family resolution, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. The sister I had loved and protected for 28 years was gone, replaced by someone who would steal from her own family and feel no remorse. But justice was coming one way or another. What none of us knew was that Mackenzie had been preparing her own desperate countermove, one that would temporarily turn our alliance against itself and nearly destroy everything we had worked to build. These are the first 4 parts of your story. Each part flows naturally into the next while building tension and developing the revenge plot. The story maintains the Reddit-style family drama with financial fraud manipulation and growing alliances. David's meeting with Mackenzie was scheduled for Thursday evening at their apartment. Our alliance had agreed that he would present our ultimatum, clearly full restitution of the $90,000 stolen from the family trust, public acknowledgement of her crimes, and genuine apologies to everyone she had wronged. If she refused, we would proceed with criminal charges and civil recovery actions. I spent that evening anxiously waiting for David's call, expecting to hear that Mackenzie had either broken down and confessed or doubled down on her denials. What I did not expect was the phone call that came at 11:30 that night. "Aurelia, we need to meet immediately." David's voice was shaky and strange. "There are things about this situation that you have not told me. Things that change everything." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? I have shown you all the evidence. What could possibly change the facts?" "Just meet me at the diner where we had breakfast. Come alone and bring all the original financial documents." The line went dead. I drove to the diner with a growing sense of dread. David was already there when I arrived, sitting in the same booth we had occupied just days earlier. But everything about his demeanor had changed. The sympathetic ally who had been working with us to expose Mackenzie's crimes was gone, replaced by someone cold and accusatory. "Sit down," David said, without his usual warm greeting. "We need to discuss your role in this financial mess." I slid into the booth completely confused. "My role? David, what is going on? Did Mackenzie say something to you?" David opened a manila folder and spread several documents across the table. I recognized them immediately. They were copies of the trust fund documents, but there were additional pages I had never seen before. "Mackenzie showed me the complete trust documentation tonight," David began, his voice taking on an almost prosecutorial tone, "including the amendments that were made 3 years ago after your parents died." My heart started racing. "What amendments? I have all the trust documents. There were no amendments made after my parents passed away." David pointed to a specific paragraph in one of the documents. "According to this amendment signed by all 4 siblings, the trust was restructured to allow individual family members to access funds for major life events without requiring approval from other beneficiaries. Wedding expenses are specifically listed as an approved use." I grabbed the document and read the paragraph he was indicating. The language was clear and seemed legitimate, but I had never seen this amendment before in my life. More importantly, the signature attributed to me looked genuine, much more convincing than the crude forgeries I had discovered on the bank withdrawal forms. "David, this is impossible," I said, my voice rising with panic. "I never signed any amendment to the trust. I would remember agreeing to something this significant. This has to be another forgery." But even as I said it, doubt was creeping into my mind. The signature looked remarkably similar to my own handwriting. The document had official legal formatting and appeared to have been notarized. How could Mackenzie have created something this sophisticated? David's expression was hard and unsympathetic. "Mackenzie explained everything tonight. She said you have been managing the family finances since your parents died, and that you agreed to this amendment to give everyone more autonomy over their inheritance. She said the reason you are angry now is because you have been skimming money from the trust yourself, and her legitimate withdrawals exposed your own theft." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "That is absolutely insane. I have never taken a penny from that trust that was not properly authorized. Every transaction I have made is documented and legitimate." "Then explain this," David said, producing another document. It was a bank statement showing several large withdrawals from the trust fund over the past 2 years, all authorized with my signature. The amounts were substantial: $8,000 here, $12,000 there, totaling nearly $50,000. I stared at the statement in shock. These withdrawals had definitely happened. I could see them on the bank's official letterhead, but I had no memory of making them. More disturbing, I could not account for where that money had gone. "David, I swear to you, I do not remember making these withdrawals. Something is very wrong here." My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I was seeing. "Mackenzie said you would deny it," David replied coldly. "She said you have been manipulating the family finances for years and that you tried to frame her when she started asking questions about the missing money." The conversation continued for another hour, with David systematically dismantling every piece of evidence I had presented against Mackenzie. According to the documents she had provided him, I was the one who had been stealing from the family trust. The forged signatures on Mackenzie's withdrawal forms were explained away as legitimate transactions under the amended trust agreement. Most devastating was David's revelation that Mackenzie had recordings of phone conversations where I allegedly admitted to taking money from the trust. "She played them for me tonight," David said, your voice clearly acknowledging that you had been using family money for personal expenses. I left that meeting feeling completely shattered. Everything I thought I knew about the situation had been turned upside down. Either I was losing my mind and had somehow forgotten making major financial transactions, or Mackenzie had constructed an elaborate counter-conspiracy that made me look like the criminal. The drive home was a blur of confusion and panic. How could there be official documents that I had no memory of signing? How could there be bank records showing transactions I did not remember making? Most terrifying of all, how could there be audio recordings of conversations I could not recall having? I spent the entire night going through every financial document in my possession, trying to find some explanation for the discrepancies. The more I investigated, the more confused I became. Some of the dates and amounts matched what David had shown me, but I could find no record of where the withdrawn money had gone. The next morning brought another devastating blow. Marcus called to inform me that David had contacted him and Isabella with new evidence about the trust fund situation. "Aurelia, we need to talk," Marcus said, his voice strained with confusion. "David showed us some documents last night that suggest there might be more to this story than we initially understood. Documents that have your signature on them authorizing significant changes to how the trust operates. The alliance we had so carefully built was crumbling. David, who had been our strongest ally and most credible witness, had been turned against us with sophisticated forgeries and manufactured evidence. Worse, he was now actively working to undermine our case against Mackenzie by presenting her version of events to other family members. Isabella was the next to fall. When I called her to explain that the documents were somehow fabricated, she was hesitant and suspicious. "I do not understand how this could happen," Isabella said. "David seemed so convinced when he showed us the paperwork. He said Mackenzie has proof that you have been the one taking money inappropriately. Are you sure you have not made any mistakes in managing the trust?" Even my own siblings were beginning to doubt me. Mackenzie's counterattack was brilliant in its simplicity. She had flipped the entire narrative, making me appear to be the thief who was trying to frame her. The evidence she had presented to David was convincing enough to destroy the credibility of our case. The forensic accountant, Sarah Martinez, was my last hope for maintaining any credibility. When I called her in a panic to explain what had happened, her response was both reassuring and terrifying. "Aurelia, what you are describing sounds like a sophisticated identity theft and document fraud scheme," Sarah explained. "Creating fake legal documents and bank records requires significant expertise and resources. This is not something your sister could have done alone." That revelation opened up a whole new dimension of the crime. Mackenzie had not just been stealing money. She had been working with accomplices to create an entire alternative version of reality. The forgeries were too good, the documentation too comprehensive for her to have managed alone. "We need to bring in law enforcement immediately," Sarah advised. "This has moved beyond family financial disputes into serious criminal territory. Identity theft, document fraud, and conspiracy are federal crimes. But I was afraid that involving law enforcement now would make me look like someone who was desperately trying to cover up her own crimes. With David actively working against us, and even my siblings beginning to doubt my version of events, I felt completely isolated and vulnerable. The wedding was now just 8 days away, and instead of exposing Mackenzie's crimes, I found myself accused of being the real criminal. Our carefully planned strategy had backfired spectacularly, leaving me wondering if justice would ever be served or if my manipulative sister would successfully destroy my reputation while covering up her own massive theft. What I did not yet realize was that Mackenzie's sophisticated counterattack had one fatal flaw, and that flaw was about to bring her entire house of lies crashing down around her. My salvation came from the most unexpected source, Mrs. Patterson, the florist who had agreed to cancel Mackenzie's wedding arrangements unless new payment was made with legitimate funds. She called me on Friday morning with information that would completely change everything. "Miss Aurelia, I need to speak with you urgently about something very disturbing," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tight with concern. "Yesterday afternoon, your sister came to my shop with a young man I had never seen before. They were not just asking about payment arrangements. They were asking detailed questions about my conversation with you and David. Mrs. Patterson explained that Mackenzie had arrived with someone she introduced as her financial advisor, a well-dressed man in his 30s who seemed unusually interested in the documentation I had provided about the stolen trust fund money. This man was asking very specific questions about the bank records you showed me, Mrs. Patterson continued. He wanted to know exactly what evidence you had presented and whether I had made copies of any documents. When I told him I do not get involved in my client's financial affairs beyond payment processing, he became quite insistent. But the most alarming part of Mrs. Patterson's account was what happened next. The man had offered to pay for all the wedding flowers immediately in cash if she would agree to tell anyone who asked that the original payments had been legitimate and that I had been mistaken about the stolen money. He pulled out an envelope with what looked like $20,000 in cash, Mrs. Patterson said. When I refused his offer and told him I would not lie about financial fraud, your sister became very angry. She accused me of being part of a family conspiracy against her. Mrs. Patterson's call was the breakthrough I desperately needed. The fact that Mackenzie was working with an unknown accomplice who had access to large amounts of cash confirmed Sarah Martinez's suspicion that this was a sophisticated criminal operation, not just family financial disputes. I immediately called Sarah with this new information. Her response was swift and decisive. We need to set up a meeting with law enforcement today. This confirms that we are dealing with organized fraud, possibly involving identity theft rings or financial crime networks. Sarah arranged for us to meet with Detective Linda Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit of the County Sheriff's Department. Detective Rodriguez specialized in complex fraud cases and had extensive experience with family financial crimes and identity theft schemes. The meeting took place that Friday afternoon in Detective Rodriguez's office. When I presented the complete case file, the original audit report, the suspicious amended trust documents David had shown me, and now Mrs. Patterson's account of being approached with bribery attempts, Detective Rodriguez's demeanor became very serious. This pattern is consistent with organized financial fraud operations, Detective Rodriguez explained. What typically happens is that criminals identify families with accessible assets. Then they cultivate relationships with family members who can provide access to accounts and personal information. Detective Rodriguez's theory was chilling. Mackenzie might not have been the mastermind of the theft, but rather a victim who had been recruited and manipulated by professional criminals. The sophisticated forged documents, the fake audio recordings, and the attempts to bribe witnesses all suggested involvement by people with extensive experience in financial fraud. We see this frequently, Detective Rodriguez continued. Someone gets involved with the wrong person, often a romantic relationship or friendship, and they gradually get pulled into criminal activity. By the time they realize what is happening, they are too deep in to get out easily. This theory was supported by the timeline of Mackenzie's behavior changes. The theft had begun shortly after she started dating David. But now I was wondering if there had been someone else in her life during that period. Someone who could have provided the expertise needed for the sophisticated fraud scheme. Detective Rodriguez wanted to interview all the key players immediately, starting with David. When she called him to request a meeting, his response was revealing he agreed to come in for questioning, but he insisted on bringing a lawyer. That is interesting, Detective Rodriguez noted. Innocent people usually do not feel the need for legal representation when they are helping with a fraud investigation. Either he knows more than he has been telling you, or he has been given legal advice that suggests he might be criminally liable. The detective also wanted to examine the original documents that David had shown me, the amended trust agreement, and the bank records that seemed to implicate me in financial wrongdoing. When she reviewed them with her fraud analysis team, the results were definitive. These documents are sophisticated forgeries, Detective Rodriguez announced after the analysis was complete. The paper stock is correct, the formatting looks official, and the signatures are convincing. But there are several technical indicators that prove they are fake. The forged documents contained microscopic inconsistencies in the printing quality that indicated they had been created using high-end document reproduction equipment. The signatures, while visually convincing, showed subtle pressure patterns that proved they had been traced, rather than written naturally. Most importantly, the notary stamps on the amended trust documents were fake. When Detective Rodriguez contacted the notary whose seal appeared on the documents, they confirmed that they had never notarized anything for our family and that their official seal had been stolen from their office 6 months earlier. "This confirms that we are dealing with professional criminals," Detective Rodriguez said. "Stealing notary seals and creating documents of this quality requires significant resources and expertise." But the biggest breakthrough came when Detective Rodriguez traced the source of the cash that had been offered to Mrs. Patterson. Using surveillance footage from businesses near the florist shop, investigators were able to identify the vehicle that Mackenzie and her accomplice had used. The license plate traced back to a rental car company, and the rental agreement provided the name of the man who had been with Mackenzie Trevor Morrison, a 34-year-old with an extensive criminal history involving financial fraud, identity theft, and document forgery. Trevor Morrison is exactly the kind of person we would expect to see in this type of case, Detective Rodriguez explained. He has been arrested multiple times for fraud schemes targeting families with accessible assets. His method is usually to develop relationships with vulnerable family members and manipulate them into providing access to financial accounts. When Detective Rodriguez showed me Trevor's photograph from his criminal record, everything suddenly made sense. I recognized him immediately. He was the financial advisor that Mackenzie had been mentioning for the past year, the person who had supposedly been helping her manage her money and plan for the wedding. Trevor Morrison was not David's rival or some mysterious accomplice. He was the mastermind who had been manipulating Mackenzie from the beginning, using her legitimate access to the family trust to fund his criminal operations while simultaneously setting her up to take the blame if the scheme was discovered. "Your sister is both a perpetrator and a victim," Detective Rodriguez explained. "She made the choice to steal from your family, but she was manipulated into doing it by someone who has made a career out of exploiting people exactly like her." This revelation completely changed my understanding of the situation. Mackenzie was not the sophisticated criminal mastermind I had imagined. She was someone who had been seduced by a professional con artist who had convinced her that stealing from her own family was justified and that she deserved the money more than her siblings. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement was involved. Detective Rodriguez obtained warrants to trace all the financial transactions, examine the forged documents for fingerprints and DNA evidence, and monitor communications between Mackenzie and Trevor Morrison. Within 48 hours, they had uncovered the full scope of the fraud scheme. Trevor had not only been manipulating Mackenzie to steal from our family trust, but he had been running similar operations with at least 6 other families in the region. The total amount of money stolen across all his schemes was over $800,000. The evidence against Trevor was overwhelming fingerprints on the forged documents' DNA, evidence on the notary seals, and recorded phone conversations where he coached Mackenzie on how to forge signatures and create false justifications for the theft. But perhaps most damaging were the text messages between Trevor and Mackenzie that revealed the true nature of their relationship. Far from being a romantic partnership, Trevor had been systematically manipulating her emotions and exploiting her insecurities to convince her to steal larger and larger amounts of money. "You deserve better than your family gives you," read one message from Trevor. "They have always underestimated you, and now it is time to take what is rightfully yours." Another message was even more explicit. "The money is just sitting there doing nothing. Your family will never even notice it is missing, and by the time they figure anything out, we will be long gone." The messages revealed that Trevor had been planning to disappear with all the stolen money immediately after Mackenzie's wedding, leaving her to face the consequences alone. The elaborate wedding was not a celebration of love, but a distraction designed to keep the family focused on the festivities, while Trevor completed his theft and prepared his escape. Detective Rodriguez arrested Trevor Morrison on Wednesday, 3 days before the scheduled wedding. When they searched his apartment, they found evidence of fraud schemes targeting multiple families, sophisticated document forgery equipment, and over $200,000 in cash that had been stolen from various victims. But the most shocking discovery was a detailed plan for Mackenzie's future. Trevor had been preparing to frame her as the sole perpetrator of all the thefts across multiple families, using her as a scapegoat while he disappeared with the money. The wedding was supposed to be his final performance before vanishing forever. With Trevor in custody and the truth finally exposed, Detective Rodriguez arranged for Mackenzie to come in for questioning. What happened during that interview would determine whether my sister would face criminal charges as a co-conspirator or be treated as a victim of manipulation who could cooperate with the prosecution. The moment of truth was finally arriving, and with it, the justice that had seemed impossible just days earlier. The interview with Mackenzie took place on Thursday morning in Detective Rodriguez's office. I was allowed to observe from behind a one-way mirror as my sister finally faced the complete truth about Trevor Morrison and the criminal scheme she had been manipulated into joining. When Detective Rodriguez presented Mackenzie with the evidence against Trevor, the text messages, the forged documents, the criminal history, and the plan to frame her for all his crimes, the transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. The defiant, manipulative person who had been fighting our family for months crumbled completely. "I thought he loved me," Mackenzie whispered, staring at the text messages where Trevor discussed using her as a scapegoat. "He said we were going to start a new life together after the wedding. He said my family was holding me back from my true potential." Detective Rodriguez explained how Trevor's manipulation had worked. He had identified Mackenzie as someone with legitimate access to family money, then systematically exploited her insecurities and resentments to convince her that theft was justified. Every step of the criminal scheme had been designed to make her more dependent on him while increasing her criminal liability. "He told me that successful people take what they deserve instead of waiting for permission," Mackenzie continued, her voice breaking. "He said the trust fund money was mine by right, and that my family was just trying to control me by making it difficult to access." The interview revealed the full extent of Trevor's psychological manipulation. He had convinced Mackenzie that her family did not appreciate her, that she deserved a better life than she could afford on her retail salary, and that taking money from the trust fund was simply claiming what was rightfully hers. But perhaps most manipulative was how Trevor had coached her responses when the theft was discovered. The aggressive denials, the accusations against me, and the elaborate counter-narrative with forged documents had all been Trevor's strategy to deflect suspicion while he prepared his escape. "He said that if anyone ever questioned the withdrawals, I should make them look like the problem," Mackenzie admitted. "He helped me create those fake documents that made Aurelia look guilty. He said family members always turn against each other in financial disputes, and that I could use that to protect us." When Detective Rodriguez asked if Mackenzie was willing to cooperate with the prosecution against Trevor, her response was immediate. "I will do whatever it takes to make this right. I know I made terrible choices, but I see now how he manipulated me into believing his lies." The cooperation agreement was swift and comprehensive. In exchange for testifying against Trevor and providing evidence about his criminal operations, Mackenzie would plead guilty to misdemeanor theft charges instead of facing felony embezzlement prosecution. She would also be required to make full restitution to all the victims of Trevor's schemes, not just our family. But more importantly than the legal arrangements was what happened when Mackenzie and I finally faced each other after the interview. The sister I remembered from before Trevor's manipulation was still there, buried under months of lies and criminal behavior, but finally ready to acknowledge the truth. "Aurelia, I am so sorry," Mackenzie said, tears streaming down her face. "I know that does not begin to cover what I have done to our family. I stole from you, I lied about it, I tried to make you look like the criminal. I do not know how you can ever forgive me." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Mackenzie explained how Trevor had gradually isolated her from the family. convincing her that we were jealous of her success and trying to hold her back. Every family interaction had been filtered through his manipulation, turning normal conversations into evidence of our supposed resentment. He made me believe that you all thought I was a failure, Mackenzie said. Every time someone made an innocent comment about money or work or relationships, he would twist it to mean something negative. I started seeing attacks everywhere, even when they were not there. The wedding was canceled immediately. David, who had been unknowingly dating my sister while she was involved with a criminal, was both relieved and devastated to learn the truth. The relationship was over, but David proved his integrity by cooperating fully with the investigation and helping to recover additional evidence against Trevor. I fell in love with someone who did not really exist, David told me during one of our final conversations about the situation. The woman I thought I was marrying was just a character that Trevor helped her create. I am grateful the truth came out before we went through with the wedding. The financial recovery process took several months, but Detective Rodriguez's investigation had been so thorough that most of the stolen money was recovered and returned to the victims. Our family trust fund was restored to its original balance plus interest and damages that Trevor was required to pay as part of his plea agreement. Trevor Morrison ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges including organized fraud, identity theft, document forgery, and racketeering. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all his victims. His criminal network was dismantled, preventing similar schemes from targeting other families. Mackenzie served 6 months in county jail and was placed on probation for 3 years. She was also required to attend counseling for victims of manipulation and financial crimes. Most importantly, she had to perform community service helping other families who had been victimized by financial fraud schemes. The healing process for our family was gradual but genuine. Mackenzie's participation in victim counseling helped her understand how Trevor had exploited her psychological vulnerabilities while also helping her take responsibility for her own choices in the criminal scheme. The first real breakthrough came 6 months after Trevor's arrest during a family dinner at Grandma Rose's house. For the first time in over a year, all 4 siblings were together, without tension or hostility. I know I have a long way to go to earn back your trust, Mackenzie said to all of us. But I want you to know that I understand now how much damage I caused. Not just the money, but the way I treated all of you. Trevor did not make me steal from you. He just gave me excuses for choices I made myself. Marcus, who had been the most angry about the theft, was the first to acknowledge Mackenzie's efforts to make amends. What matters now is that you are taking responsibility and working to make things right, he said. We are family, and family forgives when people genuinely change. Isabella, who had been most hurt by the betrayal, took longer to rebuild trust. But over time, seeing Mackenzie's consistent efforts to repair the damage and her genuine remorse for the pain she had caused the relationship slowly healed. The most meaningful moment came when Mackenzie used her community service experience to help another family that had been victimized by a fraud scheme similar to Trevor's operation. Watching her counsel a young woman who had been manipulated into stealing from her own relatives, I saw that my sister had truly learned from her experience and was committed to preventing others from making the same mistakes. I understand exactly how you are feeling right now, Mackenzie told the young woman during one of their counseling sessions that I was allowed to observe. The shame, the guilt, the fear that your family will never forgive you. But I also understand how someone can make you believe that theft is justified when it absolutely is not. Today, 3 years after the truth was finally exposed, our family relationships are stronger than they ever were before the crisis. The experience taught all of us important lessons about communication trust and the importance of addressing problems directly instead of letting resentments build over time. Mackenzie rebuilt her life completely. She left retail and went back to school to become a financial counselor, specializing in helping families protect themselves from fraud schemes. Her personal experience with both perpetrating and being victimized by financial crimes gives her unique credibility with her clients. She never married David, but they maintained a friendship based on their shared experience of being manipulated by Trevor. David eventually met someone else and had a modest, genuine wedding that Mackenzie attended as a friend, not as someone trying to compete or impress anyone. The family trust fund still exists, but we restructured it with better oversight and communication requirements to prevent future abuse. Most importantly, we learned to talk openly about money resentments and family dynamics instead of letting problems fester in silence. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that Trevor Morrison did not create the problems in our family. He just exploited existing weaknesses and communication gaps. Mackenzie's feelings of inadequacy and resentment were real, even if Trevor manipulated them for criminal purposes. The justice that was ultimately served went beyond just sending Trevor to prison or recovering the stolen money. The real justice was our family learning to communicate honestly, address problems directly, and support each other through difficult times instead of letting manipulation drive us apart. Has your family ever faced financial betrayal that tested your relationships? Have you experienced the satisfaction of seeing justice served when someone who manipulated your family finally faced consequences? Share your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and I know how healing it can be to connect with others who understand family karma. If this story of family revenge and ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about overcoming family betrayal. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that truth always comes out eventually, and that families can heal even after devastating betrayal. Thank you for joining me through this journey of uncovering fraud, seeking justice, and ultimately finding that love and forgiveness are possible even after unimaginable family betrayal. Remember that standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult, is always worth it in the end.